This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. Yes, I am your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to a special 4th of July weekend edition of the Spirit and Wellness Show. I apologize for not being on the air last week at my usual time due to technical difficulties, which, when you are dependent on someone else's technology to do your broadcast, you're at the mercy of that technology, whether or not it works. So in this case, it wasn't working so well last Sunday, so unfortunately I was not able to do my usual live broadcast. And again, apologies all around. Hope you didn't miss me too much. So, 4th of July weekend. And this is the program where we take a look at what's going on around us in the world, and we look at it from a higher perspective, from a spiritual perspective, if I'm allowed to use the S word. And let's think about 4th of July and what that means. If you're in the United States, of course, it has a great meaning. If you are not in the United States, you know what it's about, but you might not have much connection to it. It's called Independence Day. And so I thought a meditation on what independence means would be interesting to have at this point. Independence, in the historical context in which we talk about it regarding the United States, of course, means the independence of our country from Great Britain, from which we, sprung from. And of course, that Independence Day was the day that we declare ourselves our own country, basically. So, looking about the world, it's interesting to see how many countries are doing that. How many countries have, since we declared our independence back in 1776, released the shackles of those powers that wish to control them. Those imperial types that, well-meaning though they may have been, and helpful as they may have been, were controlling and creating a shadow under which it was impossible or very hard to flower and grow and become the country that they needed to be. Most of the Caribbean islands that were owned and run by European countries such as Great Britain and France have declared their independence. They are independent countries now. India, ruled by Great Britain for many years, famously declared itself independent in the early part of the 20th century. And Gandhi was no small part in that. So many countries in Africa have released themselves from the dependence on European overlords, if you will. So it's interesting to think about that in relation to independence and how we as a humanity are evolving in that direction, are evolving in the direction of understanding our own uniqueness, either as a country, as a state or town, family, or individual. We start to evolve to the point where we are allowed to express ourselves in the ways and in the types of activities that we wish to express ourselves in. You look at the Arab Spring, that's what's been happening in the Middle East, is a movement towards a freedom. And the struggle, which is very symbolic of the struggle we're all having between traditional forces that wish to rein us in and our instinct towards individualism. The struggle with, particularly with one religion, the religion of Islam, and the more conservative factions of the religion of Islam, is creating this tug of war. Because as we evolve towards a more individualistic or independent sense of ourselves, that reflects in our connection with spirit. We start to understand that we are connected to divine mind, if you will, without necessarily having to follow the traditions of our ancestors, without necessarily having to become part of a monolithic group that thinks and acts in accordance to certain laws that are not, and I say that with hesitancy because I know I will get response from this, but these laws, whether you are Christian or Muslim or Jewish, these laws are man's interpretation of God. They are not the divine word. They are man's interpretation of such. And as such should always be taken as they are. A version of what a set or group of people who have fervent belief think that God and Spirit is, and how they should relate to it. And if you agree, if you're part of that, then that's wonderful. That works for you. However, when you're in a situation where these laws that you live your life by, or are asked to live your life by, are not dynamic, are not fluid, they don't change over centuries of time, then your relationship with the divine, with spirit, also stagnates. Because your relationship with spirituality, and here again is another one of the many differences between spirituality and religion. Spirituality is dynamic. It's always changing because you're always changing and growing. And spirituality is about that growth, is moving that growth. Religion, on the other hand, seeks for you not to have such growth. Instead, it seeks for you to turn over your sense of, or your connection to spirit, to the church that you're involved with, and let them handle it. They'll tell you how to be. They'll tell you whether or not it's okay for you to be in a gay marriage. They'll tell you all of that. You don't need to think about that stuff. They'll tell you. So it is, as I mentioned, very interesting to see the growth and development of independence as a worldwide phenomenon. Just worldwide, people are more free, even if they're living in a country that doesn't particularly have the kind of freedoms we have in the United States. People are still much more free now than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Right? People in Russia, while they don't have the same freedoms as we do in America in some ways, are a lot freer than they were at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Bolsheviks took over, or even under the Tsar previous to that. Countries that were ruled by monarchies for centuries, in which the peasant classes or what have you were kept under the thumb of the ruling classes. Well, that situation doesn't exist in that way anymore. There are still class problems. Many of them based on economics rather than birthright, which is a huge difference. But in general, people are becoming more free. They're becoming more prosperous as well. There's still poverty. I'm not trying to say there's not poverty. I'm saying that countries that were languishing in poverty, including countries like India, countries like the countries in Africa, are experiencing newfound prosperity. Developing countries are catching up and in some cases surpassing the traditional countries as far as their economic growth is concerned. While European economic growth starts to slow down, Chinese economic growth has been exponential, as has Indian growth. And Africa is on its way. Our president visited Africa last week, and the visit was to reconnect with the countries in that continent, to let them know that we were on their side and that we were going to help them develop. And we did this because we realized that China and India were already involved heavily in supporting Africa in technology, infrastructure, all of the things they need to grow and prosper in the 21st century. And we realized that if we want to maintain good relations, we need to be there too. So it's heartening to see all of these things going on. And while we're in Africa, let me take a moment of prayer for Nelson Mandela. Talk about an independent spirit. This man's legacy will inspire us all for centuries to come. This man's legacy, like Martin Luther King's legacy, like the legacy of Gandhi, men of peace, but men of action, men of courage, and yes, true independent thought. These were people who, when told, this is how things are, and they will never change, so get back in line. These are people, when they were told that, didn't believe it. These were people who, when told that things will never change, didn't believe it. They set their sights on change. They took the action that it takes to create that change. But more than that, they saw the truth. The truth of who and what we really are, which is free. And they understood that truth. And they understood that what was around them, what people in power were trying to tell them, was the lie. And the more they practiced the truth, the more frightened those who were connected to the lie became. And when that sort of fear is engendered, of course, all sorts of restrictions come. People are put into prison. People are kept down, locked out, pushed aside. Military action is taken to squash any kind of movement towards truth. because for them, truth is a scary thing. It doesn't have to be. And in fact, if you hold a vision of truth that involves everybody, you may be able to mediate that fear that motivates those in power to try to desperately cling to it. As I talk about this, of course, I'm thinking about what's going on in Egypt, if you're not aware of what's going on in Egypt. The duly elected leader, Muhammad Arsi, has been deposed. And the reason that he was deposed was because Egypt had a revolution earlier on, and part of this Arab Spring, which Egypt was a big part of, was for the Egyptian people to be able to elect their own leader. Well, the leader they elected turned out not to be the leader they expected. He turned out to be someone who wanted to take Egypt back to more restrictive times. And he also turned out to be someone who wanted to make the leadership, the government of Egypt, tied to the religion of Islam. And the people of Egypt, many of them, are too independent to sit still for that. And so he was asked to step down. He didn't want to step down. And the Egyptian military stepped in and brought him down with no violence. There's violence now because of the clashes on the street, but there was no violence in the changing of the guard, if you will, in the Egyptian government. The Egyptian army, you have to understand, is very different from most armies. Whereas most armies are there to clamp down on the people and sort of repress them and keep them in line, the Egyptian army is very connected to its people. The Egyptian army works as an arm of the people. And so when the Egyptian army came in to tell Mr. Morsi he needed to step down, they were doing it on behalf of the majority of the Egyptian people who were tired of a rule in which they were allowed to starve, a rule in which there was no movement towards the change they wanted. And so this is why this has happened. And again, this is this tension that I've talked to you about as far as independence is concerned. You have the faction represented by the Muslim Brotherhood that wants Mr. Morsi, who is a member of their group, back in power, that wants Islam rule in Egypt. And you have the people who do not want to be ruled by a set of laws from a particular religion. And it's a very powerful, as I said, symbol of the fight for freedom, the fight for independence, and something to reflect upon on this 4th of July weekend. So, those are some interesting thoughts about independence and how we, as a humanity, are recognizing that, and that is reflecting in our sense of spirituality, our relationship to spirit. And you can see it in the number of people who are withdrawing from religions, calling themselves spiritual but not religious. And a lot of people, as I say, either think that that is not a particularly strong difference, or they think that you're lying to them when you say that, or that you're just some religious zealot in some sort of new clothing. But this is not the case. This is a very, very important distinction. And that's why on my show, I talk about that a lot and continue to talk about why and how spirituality and religion are two entirely different animals. But okay, don't get me started because I'll go on for another hour and a half just on that topic. And I want to talk about the summer solstice, which I talked about in my last broadcast to you. But I'd like to further elaborate on it because, as we're now moving into summer, we want to talk about what that means and what it symbolizes. And summer has to do with the sacred fire. In Native American cosmology, it's represented by the south part of the medicine wheel. It's the fire of transformation. It's also the energy of the sun. It's the energy that you have in childhood. Childhood is very much a part of this particular position on the medicine wheel. It's a time of joy and a time of energy. But more specifically, the sacred fire that summer brings is a fire of transformation. It's a fire of change. It has to do with also your third chakra in the Hindu designations of chakras. The third chakra is at your solar plexus, and it has to do with your individual will. Again, independence, and how you project that. How you have your sense of self and bring it into the world. It has to do with youth and energy, as I said, but also courage and action and the fire of transformation. So I came across this prayer, a solstice prayer, if you will, and I'd like to share it with you because I think it really talks about what summer has to offer us in a spiritual way. Powers of the South, the summer, I come to you in prayer. In the midday light without shadow, I thank you for lessons of growth, passion, and relationship. I pray to be with the sacred fire of the South in a transformative way. I ask for courage in this place of action and change. I ask that my will be guided by right intention and that my medicine be good under the bright sun. Let my idealism come not from self-righteousness or anger, not from arrogance. Powers of the South, I pray for the soul's awakening to love and for the vigor of youth to be within my sacred dance. May I express through every aspect of manifestation the joy and grace of life's vitality. May I live fully. So you can see how summer is this sort of joyous embracing of life. You know, kids are off school, people go on vacation, and go on adventures, and try to live as fully as they possibly can. And as I said, it's also a time of courage and action and change. And as we've been talking about throughout this show, we're seeing how action and change is happening in the world, moving us towards a more independent self for all. Last week, the United States Supreme Court made some rulings, some of which were disturbing to some and some of which were joyous for some. Perhaps the one that's most talked about are the rulings involving how the government deals with gay men and women and their desire to marry and have those marriages honored by governments. And the Supreme Court made two rulings that moved that forward significantly. The first had to do with something called DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, and basically said it was unconstitutional for the government to deny privileges, rights that married people who are straight have to married people who are gay. And the other ruling had to do with a specific ruling in California called Prop 8, in which, well, the Prop 8 was a measure that was voted on that banned gay marriage. It was taken to court, and the court decreed that it was not constitutional. So the supporters of Prop 8 took it to the Supreme Court, hoping that the Supreme Court would overturn that ruling, which they did not. They turned it back to the states. So, the issue of gay marriage has been resolved for the state of California. There apparently is much more to work on because each individual state has its own policies towards gay marriage. But many people who are part of that community and many who aren't but support them are quite happy with that. A less happy experience had to do with the Civil Rights Act. There's a portion of the Civil Rights Act in which the southern states that have a history of denying voting rights to racial groups, especially black people, needed to get approval from the federal government before they made any changes to their state voting laws. The Supreme Court said that that was an outdated measure because times have changed and people have evolved. Now, there are many who had a very strong negative reaction to that, and it's understandable because it takes away a protection. And there are many states in the South that apparently are trying to take advantage of that and put in laws that restrict voting through things like, voter ID laws and things of that nature that make it more difficult for the poorest and less able of us to vote. However, it's interesting, in the context of what we've been talking about on the show today, how the Supreme Court is sort of acknowledging the fact that, yes, things have changed. And things have changed in the South. There's no doubt about that. That does not mean that there's no more racism. That does not mean that they will not try to disenfranchise people of color. It just means that it's a different era, it's a different time, and in response to that, they need to update the laws to reflect that. So what the Supreme Court has said is that Congress now has to come up with new ways to do this. And everyone's concerned about that because our current Congress seems to get deadlocked very easily on just about any issue you can name. And so the fear is that this won't get done. But I believe that it will, and here's why I believe that it will. Because it is a reflection of our evolving nature. And our evolving nature evolves, whether we think it will or not, whether we want it to or not, whether we actively advocate for it or actively shy away from it, it happens anyway. And our laws and our lawmakers will always be reflections of that. So, if it's an issue you care about, you should certainly make your feelings known to your congressman or whatever. But have no fear, because we are evolving. We are becoming
becoming who and what we truly are. Aspects of divine mind. Have a wonderful week.